Hi, welcome to the Federal. I'm Harish Upadhyaya. As the Taliban interim government prepares to take over the administration in Afghanistan, there are several issues that are under focus right now. One, what happens to India Taliban relationship? At the same time, the role played by several other big countries, and also, can these countries ensure that Afghanistan doesn't become a problem for Central Asia and the larger world as well? To put this in perspective, who better than Mr. Ganapthi, Ambassador Ganapthi? He's been the former Secretary of Ministry of External Affairs and also served as ambassador in this region and knows this region inside out. Welcome, Ambassador, to the show.
Good evening, Mr. Upadhyaya. It's a pleasure to be on your screen. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm hoping you could probably put several of these issues and topics into perspective for our viewers. To begin with, an interim government has been announced. How would you look at this? Because there's been so much talk about it. Why Taliban took so much time to decide interim government and the cabinet, the kind of discussions that happened, also the faces in there, right? Many are saying these are people who have been declared as terrorists by the United States, have big bounty on their head, on UN sanctioned list as well, some of them. So how would you look at this interim cabinet of the government that's been announced in Afghanistan?
Yes, I think that's a very important point to ponder upon because, as everyone is aware, you had the Taliban take over Kabul on the 15th of August, and today is already the 9th of September. The government, of course, was formed and announced day before. So obviously, it took them nearly 20 odd days to sort this out, even though there had been rumors that the government was very much on the way and that the announcement would have been made by the early part of September. So there were differences within the leadership group of the Taliban itself. And more importantly, I think you should not forget, and one should underline the role of Pakistan in this regard. The fact that the DGISI, Faiz Hamid, was in Kabul from the 4th of September, literally on the eve of the government formation, conveys the message that he had to be there to break a few heads, as they would say, to ensure that whatever government is formed in Kabul by the Taliban is not only Pak compliant, but also strongly follows the Islamic Sharia. So the role of the ISI here has to be emphasized again, right from the formation of the Taliban, is crucial because, as we are all aware, even though the Taliban might have been formed around Kandahar, it was the role of the Northwest Frontier Province or the Pakhtunkhwa region, which could say that saw the monster which was Taliban at that point in time fructify, belabor, and form into what it is today. Now, the second important point we should note is, if you recall the Doha agreement, which was signed with the United States, and an agreement which we have never seen before, which says between the Islamic Emirates of Pakistan, Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, also known as the Taliban, and not recognized by the United States. I think it's a very unusual wording. But if you look at the Doha document, it says that whatever government is formed in Kabul would be all-inclusive and broad-based. Is it all-inclusive? Definitely not. Only the crumbs have been thrown at the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, and others. Here, I think it's very pertinent to bring out the fact that the population of the composition of the population in Afghanistan, as available in the United Nations from earlier this year, is that it comprises of 40% of Pashtuns, 27% Tajiks, around 9% Uzbeks, 10% Hazaras, and the others. So obviously, if in a cabinet of around important posts are being occupied by around 22, if you have only 3 from the other communities, that is one Uzbek who is a deputy prime minister, and 2 Tajiks, the minister of economy and another minor role, deputy of the intelligence, obviously it's not all inclusive. Is it broad based? Definitely not. There are no women in the cabinet. So obviously, all the assurances given in Doha and beyond have not been met at all. And third important point you should notice is there's a state of uncertainty still prevailing. So, how will these ministers be able to acquit themselves? Let us not also forget the role of the Haqqani in the entire ministry formation. Uh, okay, you have Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is the Minister of Interior, which is the most important element in any government. The Home Minister is an important portfolio. So if Sirajuddin Haqqani is, who is very close to Al Qaeda, who has been responsible for the bombing of the Indian embassy in 2008 and anti-India activities in 2009 and 10, also involved in various other activities against the USA and everyone else. If he is the interior minister, what sort of role would the Haqqanis and by extension their Pakistani masters play in this regard would be crucial. You should also not forget the fact that, as you rightly said, and we should recall, that many of the ministers are still in the sanctions list. So, and delisting is not an easy process, if you would know. I think it has to go to the 1988 committee, of which India is the chairman. And any delisting has to be through consensus by the 15 members of the United Nations Security Council, which is nowhere near. So you have ministers who are under the UN sanctions. You have ministers who have active links with terrorist agencies and associations. You have ministers whose masters are across the border in Pakistan. You have a ministerial cabinet, which is not all inclusive and broad based. And most importantly, the supreme leader, Habibatullah Akhundzada, has not even been seen. Of course, his role, they say, would be akin to what the spiritual leader Ayatollah Khamenei plays in Iran.
Yeah.
But we don't know what sort of agenda he brings onto the table, even though we all know that he's been very active on the religious front and passes religious edicts and others. And we should also not forget the Prime Minister himself was responsible for the blasting of the Bamiyan Buddhas. It's a sacrilege. If they say there's sacrilege on one front, there's equal sacrilege when you attack another religious figure, a god to the Buddhists. So I think it is a complicated existence for the ministerial birth and recognition. The previous Taliban government of 1996 to 2001 was recognized by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and
Yes.
Pakistan. You now have 6 embassies in Kabul, which is China, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey.
Yeah.
So the role of Pakistan is underlined. But among the Islamic countries, would they follow the Saudi diktat? And what happens then would be worth watching. So I think if one were to look into the looking glass, I think it is as foggy as one could see, because you'll have to see as the tide flows to see what sort of international repercussions would be there, what sort of international reactions would be there, how it impacts the region, how it impacts the neighborhood, and of course, naturally, what sort of impact it will have on us.
And that's like you said, it looks foggy. But do you think one thing has become very clear? The kind of assurances or the projection of a certain image that the Taliban spokespersons tried in the initial few weeks, saying, no, this is a different Taliban, Taliban 2.0. They said, no, we will ensure that everyone is carried along, it's inclusive, women are given their rights. All those things that were spoken about is totally different than what actually this interim government is doing. They're already saying women can't play sports. They've already brought in certain changes in the universities. They've also ensured that a few journalists were pressurized to leave the country, or the situation was such that they had to leave the country. We've already seen yesterday firing in the air that's happening when a few women protested there. At the same time, journalists beaten up. So, do you think the initial few weeks of the kind of image building exercise is totally different than what actually has now started happening?
Well, I think to mention it realistically here, I think I have always said that we should not say Taliban 1.0, Taliban 2.0, or Taliban 2.5 or 3.5. It's Taliban, Taliban, Taliban. I mean, their bottom line is ruled by Islamic Sharia.
Yes.
The only difference between the Taliban, which was in administration in Kabul from 1996 to 2001, and the current leadership or the spokespersons of the Taliban indicates that the current spokespersons are far more media savvy. They are
Yes.
on the social media. They're able to field questions with great confidence. They are not sort of diffident, or they are not conditioned by lack of international exposure. I think, which maybe I think the ISI has done its job well in training them through the media courses. I think maybe they have their own mass communication institute or whatever they have.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, I think if you start from the Doha Accord itself, I think the Americans had clearly said that it is agreement on all the points or nothing is agreed upon. Either everything is agreed upon or nothing is agreed upon. Finally, what was agreed upon was only the withdrawal. There was no ceasefire, there was no all inclusiveness, there was no all Afghan led, Afghan owned, there was no break from the links with extremist organizations or terrorist organizations. That's why you saw the Islamic State Khorasan take such, they had an explosion created in Kabul just a couple of days after the Taliban came into office in Kabul. So obviously, and the media savvy managers maintaining that it is all different, and they would uh, ensure that women rights, minority rights, children rights are all protected, and that they will carry the entire country together, all has proved hollow, and perhaps, just sort of uh, bringing wool over your eyes, pulling wool over your eyes. So
Yes.
obviously, I think everyone was perhaps blindsided by the so-called assurances. But we, I think, some of our ambassadors who have been in Kabul were very clear, and we were very clear that in the Ministry of External Affairs, and some of my colleagues were very clear that we should see whether the words are translated into deeds. And that has definitely not happened. There's no all inclusive government, there's no broad based government. As you rightly said, women were attacked yesterday, they were pointing guns on women's chests. I think nowhere it is done. It's more barbarism. And
Yes.
look at the statements of some of the ministers on women or whatever be it. I think it should be unacceptable to countries which have the rule of law and order in their system. So obviously, I think we'll have to wait and see how the Western world reacts to it. Even though the agreement was signed between the United States and the Taliban in Doha.
True. One thing that you mentioned earlier is the role that's played by ISI and the Pakistan in the formation of this interim government. What does this mean for India-Taliban relationship? As you rightly said, many within the MEA want to probably wait and watch and ensure that Taliban acts on its words and then have a dialogue with them. We've had preliminary talks already with them. So, how do you see this panning out? Many believe that probably India is slow off the blocks on that, but how do you view it?
No, I think yes, the informal talks, as they say, there were many informal talks before the request came from the Taliban head of Doha office, Sheru, overtly and rapidly moving ahead. Is we did not know whom to talk to, because most of the Taliban leadership, be it Mullah Baradar or any of the others, had all a great Pakistan exposure. So the only person, maybe Sher Mohammad Stanikzai, was trained in the Indian Military Academy and had a lot of India in him. So obviously that was very helpful. That when he asked for a meeting, we were able to respond and invite him to the Indian embassy for the talks. Of course, as brought out by the MEA spokesperson, this was a meeting. Obviously, it was not formal talks where we were able to convey our concerns or what we would seek from the Taliban government, which was the withdrawal of the community from Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan. And secondly, to ensure that the country of Afghanistan is not made available to forces which were inimical or which would be inimical to India's national interest, which is that the Taliban would not provide it as a breeding ground for terrorism activities directed against India. Now, in terms of the government which has been formed, again, uh, I think the need to wait and watch comes out because we still are not yet aware of what sort of agenda, what sort of policy perspectives, or what sort of policy declarations will come out of or emanate from Kabul and the current administration. We are very clear that the hand of the ISI and the Pakistan government is very much behind the leadership currently established in Kabul. So, unless we are certain as to what they would, uh, how they would look at themselves being uh, able to take care of India's interests and concerns, we have to
Hmm.
be very cautious in moving ahead because there are always pitfalls. We may say,
True.
yes, we want to come in. They may say, sorry, we don't want you. Or,
Yeah.
you see, so I think in certain cases in diplomacy, everything is not done upfront. There are a
Yes.
lot of other channels of communication which are used, which are not declared, which are very overt. There are other countries, there are people from within the system, there are agencies who interact with various uh, people whom they would be able to talk to and get some response or the other through the back channels. So that is
Uh,
what would be happening.
Ambassador, you're talking about back channels and countries and communication. One interesting aspect that's being spoken about is the role that Russia will play. Many are wondering if Russia could play a role in ensuring India having any ties with the Taliban, and what will it be? What will be the terms and conditions? How will India's interests be safeguarded in Afghanistan? Do you see Russia playing a role here?
Well, I think Russia, of course, has an embassy in Kabul. Let's
Yes.
put it this way. The Russian special envoy for Afghanistan is Zamir Kabulov, who was himself an ambassador of the Russian Federation in Kabul till a couple of years ago. And Russia has been actively promoting the Moscow dialogue between the various Afghan factions over a period of time. Of course, now there are no factions because the entire country is under the administration of the Taliban. Uh, be that as it may, just a couple of days ago, there was a conversation between the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and our prime minister. And the important uh,
We've also had
text of the
NSA talks
yeah,
yesterday
text of
before.
the conversation between the two leaders, whereas the president and the prime minister, was on Afghanistan. And both sides agreed that senior leaders and officials of the two countries should continue discussions on expressing their concerns and on the future uh, as to what happens in Afghanistan. And that's how we had Nikolai Patrushev, the national security advisor to the president of the Russian Federation, in New Delhi yesterday when he met,
Yes.
when he had extensive discussions with his counterpart, the NSA, Mr. Ajit Doval, and also called on the prime minister. And the most important point, which was brought out in the statement, was that both India and Russia were unanimous in their emphasis that the territory of Afghanistan should not be used for terrorist activities in the region and against their countries. So, obviously, I think the concern of terrorism is not very much in Indian minds, but also in the minds of Russia and many other countries. Now, can Russia play a role? Of course,
Hmm.
Russia has invited us in what they call as the extended format of the Troika. Of course, the
Yeah.
Troika became a quadri because Troika included Russia, China, Pakistan, and then the USA also came into it. And in the extended format, we are already there. And not long ago, I think this was just 10 days ago, when the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was in Italy for a meeting with the Italian Foreign Minister. He did talk of various countries, including India, playing a positive role in trying to ensure that that the transfer of power in Kabul takes place. But I think at the same time, uh, I would go back to the conversation between President Putin and the Prime Minister, because there it was very, very clearly emphasized that the concerns of the two countries need to be looked at, and that is what is important. So I think Russia would definitely keep us informed for us to take an informed decision on how we should move ahead.
Well, which brings me to the point on what this means for India-US ties. If indeed Russia plays a very active role vis-a-vis India-Taliban talks or relationship, what would it mean for India-US relationship? Because we've already seen the US expressing its displeasure over India planning to acquire the S-400 missiles. So, will this be seen in isolation, or do you think this would be treated as something very local by the US?
I don't think this would have any effect, because the US is equally involved in discussions with Russia on Afghanistan. So obviously, when you look at, this would be a totally different. It should be looked at in a silo sort of situation, and not
Exactly.
have the larger picture. So, India-Russia discussions on the evolving situation in Afghanistan would have a similar sort of flow as would be the discussions between India and the United States on Afghanistan. I mean, let it be very clear that India is equally discussing the evolving situation in Afghanistan with the United States of America. The
Yes.
conversations between Dr. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is very much on the agenda. And of course, let's not also forget that the Prime Minister will be visiting the United States of America for discussions with President
Yes.
Biden, not only bilaterally, but also on the Quad format,
Yes.
sometime in a fortnight or so, when the Prime
Yes.
Minister will also be addressing the General Assembly, because we are one of the non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So I think, to answer your question straight, I would say no, no, definitely there will be no impact on India-Russia discussions on the evolving situation in Afghanistan and on the administration there, vis-a-vis India's discussions with the United States of America on the evolving situation in Afghanistan. And naturally, the USA and Russia are also having their own discussions, not to mention
Yes.
the Chinese, the Pakistanis, and others discussing with the United States and Russia. And of course, there is also the Heart of Asia Istanbul conference, we should not forget.
Exactly.
You mentioned the S-400. Of course, it is a tricky situation. I'll put it this way: India is determined that for its defense and security, it's in its sovereign right to procure what it needs from wherever it obtains it. It is quality and cost effectiveness which is going to be the ultimate determinant there. So I don't think we are going to be pressurized by the United States of America to drop our decision to procure the S-400s. Of course, the US has this CARTSA, countering American adversaries through Sanctions Act. But there have been many talks or rumors that CARTSA won't be enforced against India. So obviously, I think we'll have to wait and see, because even in the last administration, when President Trump was there, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, had said that.
Another point that, Ambassador, I briefly want to discuss is another friendly neighbor or a friendly country that is strong in the region is Iran. Do you see them playing a role here? They've made some strong statements. They've said this is what we expect from the new Taliban regime. But do you see them playing a role there?
Well, Iran, for obvious reasons, I think the sectarian issues between in the Islamic world, the Shia-Sunni divide
Yeah.
comes into play there. And if you recall, in Herat, when that part of the region is very Shia-dominated, the Hazaras,
Yeah. Yeah.
who are around 10% of the population in Afghanistan. And I think the governor of Herat, Ismail Khan, was captured literally by the Taliban, and then they handed him over to Iran.
Yeah.
So obviously, Iran has made some very strong statements that they would expect the Taliban government not to take any actions which would be against Iranian interests. because the previous government, the Taliban government from 1996 to 2001, was very much anti-Iran because, as I had mentioned earlier, only three governments, they were all Sunni majority governments, or Sunni governments which had recognized or had embassies in Kabul, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So obviously, Iran is very much interested to ensure that there is nothing which happens in Afghanistan which would be directed against its own interest. And Iran does have a presence in Kabul in the current day also. And we'll have to wait and see what happens on Chabahar and the Dilaram Zaranj highway, which
Yes.
was there for Iranian port of Chabahar to Afghanistan
Yes.
trade and onwards to Central America. So Iran has a large presence in terms of India's own exposure towards Afghanistan, because we had the Chabahar Dilaram Zaranj link
Yes.
established primarily to avoid Pakistan, which was proving a big stumbling block, and which was a stumbling block even now. When the Taliban stopped trade, import-export activities against India, I'm sure the hand of the Pakistanis should not be forgotten there. So
Yes.
obviously, we'll have to see how Iran moves ahead on those issues also, because it has a large resonance on India's own economic interests in that region and the area.
Absolutely. But one thing, probably, if we reflect over the discussion we've had over the last few minutes, probably 20 odd minutes, is that we are only talking about various countries playing a role. So, Ambassador, what's the role of the United Nations? Like, several people have spoken about it. Many have said, okay, where is the United Nations? Several others are saying that why is it not playing an active role? Uh, how would you look at the United Nations and their statements, their role, especially in the last, say, 1 month or so?
It's a very important issue there. I think not many have brought this to the attention. When India became a permanent member of the non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, I wish, I mean, my words would
We
ring true
become,
and we
yeah,
become a
true.
permanent member.
Yeah.
When we brought forward our candidature for the non-permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council, it was because Afghanistan had withdrawn its candidature. Not many have talked of that. So what would have happened if Afghanistan had continued to stay on as a candidate and had been elected to the United Nations Security Council? That would have been a very interesting question to ponder over. The second point is, the current president of the United Nations General Assembly is the Maldivian Foreign Minister, Shahid Abdullah. And who was opposing him was again an Afghan candidate. So what would have happened if Afghanistan had been the UNGA president? So, hypothetically, if they had not withdrawn or not been withdrawn the candidature or not been defeated, you would have had a Afghanistan candidacy in the United Nations Security Council and an Afghan national who would have been the president of the United Nations General Assembly. Be that as it may, one should always remember the fact: what can the UN do? UN can only do what its members asks it to do. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution on 31st August asking that there should be no terrorist activities against Afghanistan, and broad-based inclusiveness and all those words were there, as it was in the two presidential statements made. It was also very interesting that all the developments which took place in Afghanistan in the month of August took place when India was the president of the United Nations Security Council. So obviously, it was under our watch when these actions took place. So what can the UN do? I think delisting of sanctions against the leadership? No, definitely not. Who will bring it forward? It is only Pakistan which will do it, or China perhaps. I don't think any of the Western countries who were in the forefront of having the sanctions regime brought against Afghanistan through UN Security Council Resolution 1267 or the UN Security Council Resolution 1988 uh, uh, would, I mean, the Western countries would have to take a decision. And if they were to make haste in terms of trying to delist, it would also show that they have not been sincere on that front. Because many of the leaders have still not disavowed themselves of their links to terrorist agencies and organizations as Al Qaeda and ISK, the Islamic State of Khorasan province. So obviously that would be, so UN can have a question on sanctions. Well, that is not going to be on the agenda for some time to come. And also, we should also not forget that India is the chairman of the United Nations Security
Yes.
Council Sanctions Committee. Then, of course, the next question would be, as the Pakistani Foreign Minister, Mr. Qureshi, who is a very strong proponent of, I think his vein has nothing but anti-India blood right from top to toe, has yesterday remarked that the Taliban government of Afghanistan should join all the international organizations and others. So the Credentials Committee will have to decide on that. Now, the Credentials Committee, of course, is also not going to be easy because it has 9 members, and more or less the members who are permanently there are the United States, Russian Federation, and China. And the others are 6 members who are appointed by the President of the General Assembly. So the seat of the UN, what happens then? Because the current membership or the current representative of Afghanistan in the United Nations is the representative of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is the government which technically is not in office in Kabul. So I think the UN will only be, UNSG can make statements calling for peace, security, broad-based activities, inclusiveness, protection of women, minority, children rights, and so on. But the ultimate decisions is borne by the members of the UN Security Council, where you need 9 affirmative votes and no veto. And any of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, if they vote in the negative, it's as good as dead. I think the resolution is not carried. And to get 9 affirmative votes, if you have even 7 abstentions, that's as good as the resolution not carrying. So what would the other permanent members, that is France, United Kingdom, and the United States, how would they respond? And I think the permanent members also have a large influence on some of the other members. Each has its own influence on various members. So I think the UN, to answer your question in short, the activities of the UN or the actions of the UN will be largely dependent on the directions given to the UN Secretariat and the Secretary General by the members of the United Nations Security Council and by the United Nations General Assembly.
Yes. In fact, when you mentioned about the government, the Afghanistan government, which is not there now, which is kind of ousted by the Taliban, which brings me to this interesting development that's happening about Afghanistan embassies in several other countries giving a statement against Taliban. What really happens to these embassies? As a layman, one would want to know what happens to them and their status.
I think they continue in office. Of course, Amrullah Saleh is the former first vice president. He says he's the acting president, so he can say they represent him. But where is he would be a large question. Of course, it is a tricky question for any government. Like we have a representative of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in New Delhi, who continues to be in his embassy, and we continue to recognize him. He does enjoy all the diplomatic immunity and privileges as would be accorded to any member of the diplomatic community. So I think we'll have to wait and see what happens bilaterally between the so-called Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, because why I use the word so-called is in terms of recognition. Till they're recognized, they would continue to be so-called. And what happens in the United Nations, that would be another point. So I think there are certain gray areas, and of course there have been, as they say, precedents are there, but every precedent does not lead to a successive decision, which is the same as it was before, because every precedent which leads to a new development has its own resolution which has to be carried forward. You can't treat it the same way, except in financial terms. Only the Ministry of Finance can say, don't treat it as a precedent, as they always say. So obviously, I think we'll have to see how the situation develops in terms of bilaterals and in terms of international. Because let's be very clear, I don't think the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan envoys in China, Pakistan, or other places have also been uh, asked to go home. Even China has not recognized. Let's be very clear. Even though yesterday the spokesperson Wang Wenbin did say that they welcome the Taliban government because it will put an end to anarchy and etc. etc.
Yes.
China has been, of course, always in the forefront, but they have also been remarking on the fact that they would not rush headlong towards recognition. They would also see how the situation moves on.
True. My final question, Ambassador. I don't know if this is too early to talk about, but looking at the developments that have happened in the civil society of Afghanistan, whether it's women protesting in Herat, asking for their rights, or ensuring that none of their practices, whether they're practicing as a journalist or studying in a college, none of that gets affected, or the protests that we've seen outside the Pakistan embassy in Kabul. Do you think that would be a far larger challenge for the Taliban going ahead? The kind of rebellion or the protest within Afghanistan rather than any pressure from a foreign country?
I think both will play a large part, but I would feel that yes, there would be protest, not a rebellion. I don't foresee a rebellion of that order because
Okay.
the arms and ammunition, unfortunately, weapon stock. You see, in terms of
Yes.
putting down a situation or whatever, and
True.
that is largely in the control of the Taliban. And
Yes.
even when you had the problems in Panjshir, you had the
Yes.
drones from the supplied by the ISI, trying to help the Taliban to capture the Panjshir Valley and the Bazarad and the headquarters of Panjshir and all that. So obviously, I think the weapons will give Taliban a lot of edge in that. There would be protests, but ultimately, we'll have to see how long can they continue, because if they're going to suffer a lot of injuries, damages, and if there is censorship or things like that, it would create difficulty. You saw some of the Taliban so-called representatives of the Ministry of Virtue and Ministry Against Vice representatives
Yes.
whipping women. I think it's very
Yes.
cruel and barbaric. I think I excuse me. I don't think it's anything less than that. So obviously, I think, or they're saying that classes should be segregated, and who
Yes.
will teach women? It'll be either lady teachers or old men of good character. Now, good character is also very subjective term, so it is
Subjective.
not really, so to say, very objective viewpoint. So it's going
Yes.
to be very difficult to take in that. Yes, the protest in Kabul was against for women's rights and against Pakistan.
Yes.
So Pakistan should take note of that there is a large body of people in Kabul and elsewhere in Afghanistan which do not like that diktat and do not like being dictated to. Similarly, in Herat, uh, you know, but more importantly, I think people in Afghanistan have tasted a lot of liberation and their freedom.
That's what I was
So
about to say. The
it is going to
significant
be,
population that's
yeah,
grown up post
it-
Taliban.
it's going to be important. And how do the youth react would be very, very
Yes.
important. Because you have to look at the youth, if they support the women who are on the streets against the cruelty or actions which would be counterproductive which would be counterproductive for women's rights and minority rights, if the Taliban don't recognize that, that should be counterproductive. But I think the pressure from the international community would be very, very important, because that is where the finances will come in, because the US has frozen the funds of around $3
Afghanistan.
trillion which are available to the to Afghanistan. Similarly, they have clearly said that no IMF loans. Of
Yes.
course, China will send in renminbi, but that will be what is happening in Sri Lanka and other places. I think they will become a colony
Likely to
of
be more
China.
strategic as
Yeah,
well.
they'll become more a colony of China, and of course, China will like to move into Afghanistan to capture not only its minerals, it is very, very rich in minerals, and to see that it gets guarantees against the East Turkestan Islamic movement, and also see if the Belt and Road Initiative can be expanded. So I think, in a small way, the international community will have a lot to do in terms of putting the pressure besides protests. But in the final equation, the biggest winners are Pakistan and China, if you look at it that way.
Yes.
So I think that is going to be very, very important. And that is where the question of Russia, second question you asked, becomes important, because Russia has uh, taken forward its relationship with Pakistan rather actively. It has been very close to China. It's got a strategic cooperative partnership, as they say. I think primarily because of the sanctions imposed against it by the West, which is a very counterproductive measure by the West. I would say that they should not have. That is
Yes.
very, very important. We should not forget that, because I think whether the ISI would like to use Afghanistan as a strategic depth for its activities in Jammu and Kashmir. And that
Yes.
is where I think, of course, our agencies, our Home Ministry, and our uh, authorities are keeping a close watch on the situation, and they will be able to tackle it effectively, definitely. So that would be an important point. That's the last point I think I should make,
Absolutely.
because we should not
Absolutely.
forget that. Anyway, thank you very much for having me over. It was a pleasure talking to you, Mr. Upadhyay, and all
Thanks a
the very
lot.
best.
Thanks a lot,
And
Anurag.
definitely look forward to talking to you again if you want to.
Same here.
Definitely.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye
Well,
for now.
that's it in this special program. Log on to thefederal.com for more news and updates and in-depth stories.